My first question involves a little background. So I've been thinking about this panel for a very long time. These issues are something that's really important to me. And I was especially motivated to organize this conversation after reading a 2020 report written by Michael Miranda, which was published through the Art Gallery of York University. So the report is titled Waging Culture, Interrogating the Canadian Visual Artist Labor Force. So Miranda surveyed artists 3 times over several years. So the first one was in 2007, second in 2012, and then the last time in 2017 to come up with a picture on how visual artists are doing financially. So in his research, Miranda identifies some key misunderstandings about artist income. What I found most notable is that census data does not really differentiate between various sources of income. So for example, if an artist claims an annual income of $20,000, we don't really know what percentage actually comes from their studio practice versus what comes from a second job or a side hustle. So we're, there's no differentiation in the census. So my first question relates to this quote from the survey. So in 2017, over half of artists in Canada did not earn anything from their practice. This isn't to say that they didn't earn any revenue from their practice. Rather, all practice-based revenue and occasionally more was reinvested into their practice, while living expenses were earned from day jobs and side hustles. So in other words, artists are subsidizing the production of visual art culture in Canada through their labor and financial investment. So I'm wondering whether this observation of Miranda's represents your own experience as an artist and or an arts worker. So this question is open to anyone.
I would say that yes, this maps on very closely to my personal experience as an artist, and also largely in the context of smaller groups and trying to like start collectives or like artist-run centers or like something like Céline Bureau in the process of growing those kinds of platforms. I also, as a cultural worker, have found that generally that involves years of unpaid, unremunerated labor on behalf of the organizers before something can get on its feet and reach sort of the kind of administrative sustainability that would involve anyone getting even remunerated. So I think like there's a huge aspect outside of there's a huge aspect of culture workers basically subsidizing the production of culture and arts and platforms and spaces for that to happen. And I would also say that like the only time that that hasn't been true is when I've been working on a project that was deeply like very like when I was on staff at an arts organization that has been receiving core funding for over a decade or something. Even smaller arts organizations that maybe just got onto the core funding ladder often require a lot of volunteer work to sustain their operations as they try to grow their mandate to accrue more funding from the government. And that definitely creates a situation that that has this sort of rolling down the hill generational effect too, where it's always the younger, unestablished, it's always the new thing that is having to fight the hardest and actually contributing the most of its energy and labor to producing art and platforms. And the older an institution is, the more established it is, the less they're actually required to do that. So when I've been at decently funded larger institutions, that's the only time when I haven't had to put in extra hours of my own time. Well, that always happens. But like any financial resources or like more direct, like, oh, just use my equipment. Like that was the only time where it could be like, let us rent this thing from like everyone's personal equipment is their personal equipment.
It rings true to me as well. Like especially with Hearth, especially with renting. We were renting a space. We were paying people honorariums because it was just part of our mandate that like even if we couldn't supply CARFAC, which we typically couldn't, we wanted to compensate people in some way. And we were only eligible for project grants. So I guess like you were saying, there's the barrier to entry to getting grants to pay ourselves or to actually go towards rent or anything like that. We were only eligible for funding through the government that could go directly to support a specific project. So that was very hit or miss. Like we did sometimes receive that money and were able to pass it on, but a lot of the time we didn't, which just meant putting a lot of our own money into it, which came directly from our day jobs. And that is something that we've been talking about as we actually lost our space about a year ago. So going forward, we're in conversation now of like how we can make this more sustainable for ourselves or what we can potentially do once we do get to a point where we're looking for a physical space again. But yeah, this like the quote absolutely sounds right to me and checks out, I think, with a lot of people I've talked to or like artists that I know.
Yeah, and I also think that this portrait, this idea that artists are subsidizing the production of culture in Canada is definitely coherent with studies on the matter. And here I'm thinking more specifically, and I'm sure that if Michael spoke about that in his study, he also had this study in mind, but an Australian study made by Glenn Withers in 1985 that was titled Artist Subsidy of the Arts, where Withers showed exactly that artists were subsidizing the whole sector. And that's also coherent with other statistical studies that are less recent than Michael's, but that drew on larger samples. Like for instance, there was a really good study made in 2013 by the Observatoire de la Culture et des Communications du Québec that showed that on average, the median income derived from artistic activities is negative for professional visual artists. So.
Sounds great. Yeah, and the to be able to be eligible for that operational funding too. I guess I just want to mention that when we did research it, it wasn't just a matter of doing something for a couple of years. It was, I think, more than 5 years. It was like 7 years. I mean, I shouldn't speak specifically because I don't remember exactly, but it was a really long time. And then there was also this financial component where you had to prove that you'd spent a certain amount of money on a project. And that amount of money is like fully outside of what the four of us as just like working class people are able to pour into a project independently to start, like to begin with. So it just completely cuts out any potential of most smaller things or like most independent projects developing to a point where they are recognized, I guess, in that way. Or
I feel there's a real disconnect between the idea of what an artist does and the cost of what an artist does. And we talk about a lot of money, but we don't talk enough about time that goes in the production of an art piece. That's, I think I'm jumping for a point ahead, but like the when we talk about working condition and like fees, like those fees might appear generous, but if you divide them in hourly rate,
yeah,
and you remove the materials, it's not generous. Yeah, it's
well,
like
you also have situations where the fees have not necessarily like. I think there's still a problem with collectives and how do they map into the system because the system is still oriented towards like an individual artist, and I think well, maybe not fewer, but I think a lot more artists work in collectivity now, especially for bigger projects that are going to get grant funded. So even when you're looking at that or like applying to like prizes or whatever, you're not only are you shrinking the pie because you're taking out the materials, but then you're splitting it amongst a bunch of people. So how many hours, like, you know, it's like 5 hours of labor is paid
So the study, Miranda study, well, it was published in 2020. This last survey came out in 2017. So I'm wondering, do you think the situation is getting better, is getting worse from 2017, but also even from 2020 when the book comes out? We know what's happened in the past 3 years.
I think it's gotten worse, unfortunately. It just seems like it gets harder every year. And I mean, Toronto is a very specific context. The city's pretty intense, but it's like this year specifically, it kind of reached a point where I think I had a moment where I was like, oh, I knew it was always getting worse, but I didn't actually think it could get this much worse. It somehow like broke through that for me, because I think specifically this year, a lot of, well, rent kind of went down, or there were these like little subsidies or offering discounts during the pandemic because so many people left the city. I think it was the first time that vacancy rates were higher in a very long time. But now that people can't work from anywhere else again, they're coming back. So there's that. And then on top of that, people getting priced out of buying houses. So the rental market is just really, really intense. And I know that like, I guess that just is one of the major structural things clearly that influence a lot of people's lives, not just artists, but there's been a steady trickle of people leaving the city for a very long time, I think. But I would say in the last 12 months, it's actually kicked up a notch, which is kind of unbelievable. A lot of people who were thinking about it definitely like actually did it. And it's just the structural aspects of life, like food and housing, and then on top of that, actually access to supplies. Like I've talked to artists who have a really hard time getting their hands on supplies at this point, and I have a studio mate who's a photographer who told me that he's essentially stopped buying film right now because it's just way too expensive. It's like tripled in price since a few years ago.
Yeah, I think that also from like if we look at the income part of the question, we do have data that shows that the situation has worsened. And we know that, you know, the pandemic was a huge driving force in that regard. But I have in mind, like in Quebec, the Regroupement des Artistes dans l'art visuel, the professional association representing professional artists. They published a study in 2022 on their members. And the data shows that both mean and median income of artists have decreased between 2010 and 2019. So that was pre-pandemic, but also between 2019 and 2020. And so they show that like pre-pandemic, it was over 30% of artists that earned less than $20,000 a year before transfer. So that's gross income. Which if they live in Montreal means, you know, living below the poverty line. And post-pandemic, this proportion rises to 37.5%. So that's a very important increase.
That's interesting because it probably goes back to what Miranda was talking about not being able to differentiate where that income comes from. So it's not even necessarily the income from their art practice, but it's probably very tied in with the income of a second job that's going on.
Oh yeah, certainly. It's all income together because the vast majority of artists do not earn a lot more than $20,000 a year from their arts practice, I mean.
In my experience, specifically while CERB was functioning, a great deal of the people in my circle who are artists and people I worked with were like, oh, this is kind of a blessing. I mean, not the whole situation, but CERB itself offered a kind of stability that people had been craving, and the ability to access a sort of regular income that was predictable. And you know, you knew each month you were gonna get X amount, and it was gonna come in regular installments and stuff. That actually contributed quite positively. And going back to sort of Hugo's comment about how often when art is paid for, we don't consider the sort of multiple bottom lines. So there's remuneration, but then there's supplies, and then there's time, and then there's also just generally mental load. So one of the things that I heard coming up a lot in conversations I've and experienced, well, I worked full-time during the pandemic, so I didn't experience it myself, but experienced this in my sort of colleagues and people I was working with, was a great relief at not having the mental load of precarity to contend with, and that created space for better work or more positive work to come out of. Because when you're constantly changing gears and having to think about a lot of stuff, then, I mean, I'll just speak for myself, I won't extrapolate, but then the project is due and it's, the deadline, I gotta get this done, and then it's just kind of, get it good enough to push it out the door. Whereas when you are not constantly having to shift focus and navigate multiple streams and navigate multiple sort of activities, it's much easier and nicer to be like, I'm just going to make this really good.
I did want to mention that I got CERB at one point, and I remember when it happened, I just thought to myself, like, I don't want to forget that this is the most money I've ever made in my life. Like, the point at which I started making CERB was when it happened. I was making more money than I had previously working multiple part-time jobs in the arts at the same time that were, not paid particularly well. And that was a huge shock to actually experience that, to have just a moment where I was like, I'm in my house now all month, but anyway. But yeah, the emotional space was not, you do need time, space, and some sort of emotional stability to be able to create, I believe, like you guys were saying. And during COVID, that emotional space was really hard to come by, even if you did have the money and you were lucky enough to have the space. So it is really hard to approach having all three of those things. It's like one of them is almost always in precarity, is what it feels like.
I just wanted to say that I think what Rowan is saying is super important, because CERB was definitely a good policy solution. Like, it did really alleviate some of the precarity that, self-employed workers, not only artists, were facing during the pandemic. But it's absolutely important to point out that your experience, Rowan, was actually documented by a lot of professional associations representing artists. And I know that there is at least the Regroupement Québécois de la Danse, so the association representing dancers in Quebec, they did point that out in a study they made on their members during the pandemic, that the fact that so many of their members were saying that this is the most money they've been making on a continuous basis for just like a couple of months. It only lasted a couple of months. And it was $2,000 a month, but taxable income, it's not a lot of money. So when artists are saying that, like, this is the most money they made for a very long time or for forever, this is really preoccupying, and this should be really brought forward when we're speaking about CERB and when we're speaking about policy solutions, because the precarity is really real and all-encompassing.
I'm curious, beyond putting more money in artists' hands, which I think we are all agreeing is a positive thing, what other changes to material conditions, either temporary or something more permanent, do you all think could benefit artists in Canada?
Well, this is something that affected my life recently, but in Ontario, there is no rent control between leases at all, which is something that I was unaware of at one point. But I think rent control in general, but again, like, these are massive things that would benefit lots of people. But I was a little surprised by how weak the protections are in Ontario for lease transfers. I know I've heard from friends that in Quebec it's a bit better, But here they can deny it arbitrarily, and there's absolutely no cap between leases. So like everything skyrockets the moment someone leaves an apartment. And then, yeah, I don't know, maybe tool libraries, those are good.
Yeah, I think a lot about resource sharing, because, you know, we were talking about how sort of the granting system works, and you put all this effort and you apply, and generally, I mean, depending on the project or whatever, you're not supposed to use grants for, like, materials, well, materials that are reusable. Anyways, they have a complicated criteria for what is a grant-eligible equipment expense and what isn't. But if that's going to be the case, and I mean, you know, there's lots of artists who never get grants, and there's lots of ways of making resources available, like you said, tool libraries, or in the case of music, musical instrument libraries, or like just even AV equipment. There seems to be a lack, like there's not enough centralized usage of equipment that people are maybe only going to use a few times. And I know, like, back in the day, the NFB used to have animation studios that were somewhat publicly available across the entire country. So, you know, if you were in Edmonton, you could go to the NFB and you could rent time or access some kind of studio space / equipment for a period of time, like through them. And they had this trans-Canadian network. So a centralized network of places that offered space for artists as well as equipment for artists, I think could go a long way into reducing the initial barriers of entry that scare people away or keep people out of becoming practicing artists or working on their practice.
We need social protection programs that are suited for the nature of artistic practice, and for discontinuous employment, and for multiple job holding, and for a strong prevalence of invisible work. Martine Damour is a scholar who worked on this issue for the past decades, and she offered a lot of really good ideas for how to design new programs or adapt existing ones in order for artists to be able to have access to, for instance, like employment insurance. And I think it's crucial that eventually artists can have access to a pension plan and can also have access to insurance, and that they're not the only ones paying for it, but that employers are also paying for it, whether this is from the promoters with who they contract, or whether it is through the state actually putting a bit of money in the pension plans or insurance or employment insurance when they give grants and subsidies. I mean, another thing I had in mind, and more from a more material perspective, is the fact that we need one very inspiring initiative, I think, right now, is the one we saw with the artists who were behind Les Ateliers Belleville in Montreal, who just succeeded in buying the building that will host 100 to 150 artists and other external members. And they were backed by a program from the Montreal Arts Council and the Ministry of Culture and Communications in Quebec. They were also accompanied by a group called Bâtir son quartier. But I think we just need, honestly, we need, and I think this resonates with what has been said already, but we need a radical change in terms of urban planning and in terms of how we dream and act about bringing about the future we want to live in. So yeah, we need to do politics very differently, I think.
Something that I've been like reacting to, looking at things as you talked, and it's not necessarily social services, but for the study I've been working on the living situation of artists, I've not yet have the post-pandemic data, but from 2011 and 2016, you can see that artists are leaving the core centers of cities everywhere in the 4 big cities of Canada, but at a lower rate in Montreal. And I think it's going to go worse with the pandemic. But one of the the correlation we saw in terms of artists' income in Quebec is more initiative on a municipal level and provincial level that support artists that have a real consequence on the living quality of artists. Some other provinces in Canada solely rely on the federal government, which is not very accessible and not doesn't cater to a living situation or a neighborhood or a community. Like they don't really care. It's just so yeah, just like the numbers kind of show that there's an impact with social investment on different angle that keeps the artists in their communities.
If possible, I wanted to circle back to what Laurence was saying about the about Martine d'Amour, I think, and the research on. So yeah, in Canada we have we have a few systems by which, I mean, CERB was kind of an exceptional version of how we try and guarantee that people have a sustainable livelihood. So there's like ODSP in Ontario, or disability. It has different names depending on where you are, or there's social assistance, bien-aide social, welfare, that also has sort of slightly different names to where people are, and then you have employment insurance. There's a few others, but employment insurance was largely designed and came out of lobbying by seasonal resource extraction workers. So we're talking about fishing people or forestry people, and farmers, and like largely these resource-based activities that were seasonal, and it was a way of trying to ensure that those people had some access to find, if you're a fisher person, then, yes, you can only fish some of the year, but that doesn't mean you should starve the rest of the year. It makes sense. It's good logic, and Canada has a largely resource-based economy. So, but none of those things are able to equip, like, even in my personal experience interacting with EI, they don't know what to do if you have multiple streams of income, but you lose, say, your primary one, because then they're like, well, you still have this little bit coming in, you're self-employed. And it's like, well, yeah, but that bit was never going to pay my bills, or could never pay my bills, or happens once every 3 months. It's not, and I'm not trying to grow it to be more than that, because for a variety of reasons. So there's no way, like, artists automatically are put in a bind where they either have to hide their artistic income, or just obfuscate where it came from or what it is in some manner, or to, like, say an artist loses their other job, their day job, and that was maybe their primary consistent source of income. That was like the every 2 weeks paycheck. That artist is going to want to access something like EI, but then that means that they either have to say no to artistic opportunities that might come along, or they have to, do something abstract about how they communicate this situation with the government, because there's literally no way for you to even report, hey, I made this thing, it's like a one-off benefit to me this month, but it's not going to happen next month. I'm not the system is just not equipped to handle. And the reality is, artists often lead, like, you'll often see other employment spheres following what's happening in the arts to some extent. So, like, working from home was a big thing in the arts world long before it ever, like, you'd have, like, the comic book industry was all working from home for a decade before the pandemic, and like it took the rest of society a bit to catch up, or a pandemic. But you're seeing this situation where almost everybody, even if they're not an artist per se, has multiple streams of employment and income. I find in if you're sort of in your 30s in an urban center in Canada, you're probably relying on sort of multiple streams of income. So then if you lose one, you would want some kind of support while you try to figure out that gap, but just communicating that reality is so complicated, and the systems are not equipped. They're like, well, you still have some income, so you're still employed. Go, good luck. And it's like, that only made me like $200 a week, or not even $200 a month.
I just wanted quickly to just give a few examples of how we could redesign the EI program. And this is, again, like based on Martin Damo's work. But for instance, like for this redesign to be possible, we would have to lower the eligibility threshold. That's one thing. We would have to be able to take into consideration the different incomes coming from different jobs. That's another one. Finding a way for artists to not be the only one contributing to the regime. So employers, promoters, maybe the state would have to contribute as well. And then be able to calculate the invisible work and transform it into a number of hours that would be counted to be eligible for the EI scheme. And for instance, in Belgium, they have what's called la règle du cachet, and that means that for a certain fee is then transformed into a calculation of the number of hours that's been worked, and this is insurable hours of work. So it's doable elsewhere. So there are very concrete things that we could do here to make it work for artists.
I think the frustrating part is that it does seem clear that there's money for some things.
One big question I had was, we're having very explicit conversations right now about money and labor for artists. And Laurence, something that you wrote kind of inspired this question, but it's open to everyone. I was reading some of your presentation notes online, and one of the points you had made in your presentation was that we know very, very little about how artists address precarity in Quebec. And I know a lot of this is due to a lack of research. However, I find my own personal experience is that there's a lot of secrecy or unwillingness for artists to be talking about money. Just one small example that I've noticed is people posting ads for studios online, providing all the information except actually how much the studio costs. People don't want to talk about money. I don't know, maybe you guys disagree. That's what I'm curious about. Do you find this is true? And if you do, what do you think contributes to this environment?
I can go first, just saying that, you know, in the context of my research, I was interested in studying precarity, but not only in just economic terms, also in terms of like access to status, access to quality work, in terms of social protection. And when I was talking about how artists address precarity, what I had in mind is that I was interested in knowing the different ways and the different strategies that artists are going to put in place to sort of address precarity vectors, such as globalization of careers, technological acceleration, and racism and discrimination. But I do think and I'm really curious to hear James and Rowan on this, but I do think that from at least the research I've done, artists are sometimes uncomfortable talking about money, and I think that comes from plain and simple inter-individual hyper competition dynamics. The art worlds are often small, artists know each other. There are only a few places where you can turn to get economic resources that you need if you want to engage more fully in your artistic practice. So, you know, competition often do not bring the best out of people. I think we all agree on that. And the other thing that I've noticed is a certain discomfort regarding more entrepreneurial behaviors or trying to develop alternative business models. I've met a lot of artists who decided to engage maybe more fully with market-based practices, like collaborating with small businesses or certain brands. And they said that this can lead to being fairly rejected from arts communities because they're not seen as like real artists or pure artists. And that's very stereotyped, but it does feel like this still exists in a way. And I think that this is especially true for emerging artists. From the research I did a couple of years ago, I saw that, you know, this seems to eases over time as like artists, they age, they get tired of this precarity, of this hustle, and they do have like new life plans that necessitate having a more lucrative work or practice. So from my conversations with artists, there seems to be a little less judgment once you're like a mid-career artist or a senior artist. But I don't know what Rowan and James think of that. I'm really interested in their answers.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is like some sort of shame. I think, again, this is much larger than just artists, but I think people carry a lot of shame when they don't make a lot of money. And they can also carry a lot of shame if they come from money and come by it passively and then are interacting in the art scene. So I think in both ends of that, you have people sort of clamming up and not wanting to be really direct about it. But I am personally, I love talking about stuff like this. And I think it's because like I'm always curious how people, like what the actual structure of people's lives look like how they're actually making it work, like how the puzzle pieces are fitting together. Like I'll ask people how much the rent is, I'll ask how much they pay for their studio, like I don't know. And I know that it's definitely considered rude in some contexts, but in my mind, not talking about it really only ends up defending people that are taking advantage of other people. And not talking about it just kind of allows for unequal wages, like bad industry standards, people paying less than what they can afford. Like I think, I don't know, it's almost like when I think of the idea of gossip as having this kind of protective element, or it's like often people that are by talking amongst themselves, you can, or by talking to your coworkers or by talking to people in similar situations to you, you can build solidarity, you can like realize that you're being screwed over, and that can't happen unless you're forthright. So I think that not talking about it really just defends the wrong people, essentially.
I think that Rowan touched on something for sure with the idea of like I think even people who have quote unquote lucked out or found themselves in a position where they have a job that pays them well but also gives them enough time to work on their practice, I think there's shame there too. Like everyone's just ashamed about how they're making it work, however it is, whether that's like hustling and working 5 jobs, or whether that's having some kind of passive income from inheritance or family or whatever, or whether it's just getting lucky and like having one good job that's supportive. I think no matter where you're at in that, people feel kind of bad, or like that they're not doing the right thing. And I think some of that comes to the fact that often when these conversations would come up, you're in spaces with other creatives, and I think there's a sense in those spaces, and this is maybe a little bit where the shame comes, or some of the shame comes in, where everybody wishes that they were only making their money through their creative practice, and the fact that that's not a reality for anybody is a little bit embarrassing, because I don't know that it should be, but I think that it's felt as like, oh, well, we're all trying to be artists, and you always imagine there's that one artist over there who's just like purely making art. And the more I've worked with different artists across different fields and stuff, like the less that's not true of any but the very most successful artists.
Rowan, I wanted to ask about the project that Hearth did, where you guys published the Artist Workers Transparency Project. You can speak more on it, but I would maybe describe it as a crowdsourced database on wages in the arts. So people were able to submit their pay information anonymously. So I was just curious about what the response was to this project. Do you see it growing beyond the database? And is this project separate from your programming with Hearth, or do the two kind of influence each other?
The Wage Transparency Project kind of came out of a few things. And one of them was I started doing freelance install work for the first time last year. I'd kind of like learned how to do it just in my day job or like doing DIY stuff. And then I knew somebody that was involved at a gallery that invited me to work there like on a freelance basis. So I started doing it on and off. But it was really bizarre for me to be in an environment where I realized that everybody in the room was getting paid a different rate. And you set your rate, like, you know, they asked how much I want to get paid. And I just had a moment, you know, you don't want to undersell yourself, but you're entering something new, you don't really know what you're doing. And then being there and talking to the people, you realize how uneven it all is. And of course, people should get compensated more for experience, but like sometimes it was a lot. And so that was kind of like in my brain at that point. I'd also had a conversation with someone who I'd replaced at a job, who shared with me that she had been getting paid more than her starting wage was higher than the wage I was being paid after a raise. And that conversation had also happened within like the same month. So I think I was just like really stewing. I was like very, I don't know, like I could not really stop thinking about these things. And at the time I'd been like reading a bunch about the Italian autonomous movement. And specifically there was a radio station that called Radio Alice, and all of this, a lot of this stuff is in Italian, like all the primary source materials in Italian to do with this. So I actually can't read or listen to a lot of it, but from what I understand, it was a sort of leftist movement, and this radio station would have workers on the radio to just come and talk about their experiences really frankly. And I started thinking about how nice it would be if I could have people I knew in the arts come onto some sort of radio station or something and just like talk about our employers and talk about working conditions like that, because it felt really valuable. But I have no background in radio. I have like no history with that. And then I think these things just all kind of like spiraled together, and I was like, oh, I should make a spreadsheet. I was like, everyone I know is like annoyed about the same things. I should try to compile this. But yeah, it was received really well, which was a bit overwhelming at first. We got 100 submissions, I think, in the first day, which was really cool. But the upkeep kind of took a lot out of us, because it was we do all of the work for Hearth in our spare time. And I was the one that initiated it. Céline, my, I don't even put it on like Hearth co-worker, another co-founder, he helped update it a lot as well. Trying to remember all the points of the question.
Yeah, I was wondering, I know you're saying it was a quite overwhelming response, but in maybe an ideal world, how would you see this project growing beyond the database?
Right, okay. So at this point, we haven't really analyzed the data very much. We've received more than 200 submissions, and it's still active. So if anyone wants to submit, I'd encourage them to like share it with people. I think it just becomes more and more useful the more the more submissions we receive. So I think the next steps in my mind are maybe categorizing the information in easier to read ways, maybe analyzing the information in terms of demographic. We allowed people to self-identify in whatever way they wanted. So we did collect some information about like, the people's personal experiences, I suppose. And like, it would be interesting to kind of look at what wages correlate with what jobs, or what groups of people, or what ages even, because there's that information in there as well. And we've organized it and compiled it, but we just haven't done that second step very much of really taking a look at what could be drawn out of that information. And we also received a lot of people emailed us asking about it and asking if they could help, but we just didn't really have the capacity to manage other people in respect to it. So I think something else I'd like to do is kind of get back to everybody who reached out in that way and maybe organize some group discussion or just get us all in the same room. I'm not exactly sure what could come out of it. I do think it's kind of separate from our work with Hearth in that I don't have any experience as a labor organizer. Like, this was something I was really interested in putting out there, and it's just really relevant to, I think, Hearth's audience. But it's not like actually organizing people past that is not something I've done before and not something I've experienced in. So in the future, it'd be nice to kind of connect everyone at least who expressed interest, but I am not totally sure where it'll go from there.
So last year, in 2022, the Quebec government passed Bill 35. So the bill seeks to improve the working conditions of artists. It gives freelancers in non-performing arts the right to form unions, which is in line with what is already happening for the Union des Artistes, as well as establishing protections against psychological or sexual harassment at work. And I just want to clarify that the Union des Artistes only represents stage, television, radio, film performers, so not visual artists, just because that could be a bit confusing. But I was just curious if people are aware of this legislation, and if so, do you have any suggestions on how visual artists can implicate themselves in this legislation? Because to be quite honest, Hugo told me this was happening. I had no idea. So I'm not sure if people are aware, but yeah, how can artists get involved in this? Laurence, hand up.
Yeah, so I read your question and I was like, okay, I am aware of this legislation. But one thing I wanted to point out is that prior to this bill, there was already a law sort of regulating the labor conditions of visual artists. It's just that the law was different in the power, amongst others, in the power that it gave to the professional association representing visual artists, the HAV, which I spoke about a bit earlier. But still, like under this new version of the law, what changes is that the HAV now has union powers. But this law really structures the art world in that it establishes the conditions in which an organization can ask for the monopoly of representation in a specific sector. So the legal framework that we have in Quebec for collective representation is sectoral representation. So right now, there's only one union that represents visual artists, and it's still the HAV, even with the new legislation. And it's the only accredited association that is recognized by the law to represent visual artists. So it means that it's the only one who can negotiate with promoters collective agreements. So I thought, like, you know, if artists, because there's a lot of criticism around the HAV, the way it functions, the type of artists it represents, like yada, yada, it's been going on for years now. So like one way is obviously for artists to sort of get involved in the HAV and sort of try to change it from within. And then another avenue is to try to get another institution to sort of replace it. But in that case, it would have to prove that it represents the largest number of artists in the same sector. So that's quite a challenge right now. So for me, when I read your question, I was like, okay, like the visual artists, it's one thing. And then cultural workers, I know that because of multiple job holding, often cultural workers are also artists, but it's still like, it puts them into like two different like labor relations regime, right? So if we would get unions in the art worlds, I think that the most likely scenario is that we could have unions representing cultural workers. But then, like, for me, certain demands that could be interesting for unions would be social protection and a living wage. But you know, this is quite a struggle to form unions because of the sort of the industrial relations system that we have. It's like unionizing by establishment, and then cultural institutions are quite small, so that puts a lot of pressure to sort of be able to form a union in the first place. So I don't know if I'm being very clear here, but yeah, there's a lot of, I'm certainly very interested in knowing how this new law is going to influence the way that the RAV does things, like where are they when it comes to negotiating collective agreements? Because if you take a look at what's happening in the literature sector has known the exact same changes as visual artists. And now their professional association is like big time engaged in negotiating collective agreements. What's going on with the RAV, we don't know. And that's like the same problem happening again and again. It's like there's definitely a communication and transparency issue here with the association that also doesn't help it at all.
Musicians have some of the same problem, actually, because the Canadian Federation of Musicians is a sub-union of the American Federation of Musicians, and Quebec has it has a Guilde des musiciens, but it's the same relationship where it sort of exists underneath the American Federation of Musicians as like a. And this all dates back to, these are some of the oldest unions in North America, so this all dates back to the early 1900s, actually, why the unions are structured this way. And at the time, musician was a much more concrete job in the sense, and so a lot of what the unions do is help, although no one really helps that much, is around visa stuff and permissions to travel. But it used to be in the early and mid 20th century that you'd have to have like a union card in order to play in certain kinds of venues and stuff. All of that has fallen by the wayside, and none of that is really relevant. So one of the things I've found is that the musicians union is good at helping like symphony orchestra players and like music teachers working through like not music educators like who would offer like extracurricular music programs working through like community centers or like municipal services. If say the city has a rec center that offers music classes, then there's like rate cards. But for the vast majority of musicians, the dues are not in line. The dues are kind of too much, and the benefits, unless you're actually going on tour of the musicians union, are not there for the most part. And often you're performing at spaces that the musicians union can't interact with. So you have this problem where they can't help most. They're not set up and they're not designed in such a way, at least on the music side, to actually benefit most of the times that a musician would be performing or regulate. So I think that there's, and this is why I always thought the CARFAC model was quite interesting, because they're not a union, but they do. So this is the other thing that sort of irritates me about the Canadian Federation of Musicians specifically, is that because they have different rates across the country, they refuse to publicly advertise their rate cards. So not only does it not benefit musicians because they can't actually lobby for you in most of your employment situations, but on top of that, they don't even put out their baseline levels publicly. So when you're negotiating, you'll often see this happen, and if you're like follow a lot of musicians on social media or whatever, around the time that grants are due, people are like, is anyone a dues paying member of the musicians union? Can you send me the PDF of the rate card? Because it's literally like, you can find old ones, and if you know exactly how to search, you can find some of the information that's buried within, but it's not published. And so that was something that I thought CARFAC did much better, is if I ever want to know if I'm applying for a grant, or if I'm trying to come up with a budget for a project or something, if I want to know what rate to offer someone, and then it also sometimes, as Rowan, you were saying, like, you, for the shows you were putting on, you couldn't meet the CARFAC fees, and that's like not the dream or whatever, but it's also fine, but it's good to know when you're going into something like, hey, this is our budget. I know we're offering under the standard, but this is what we can offer for a variety of reasons. And there's, I think artists, and this is the other worry about unions, then doesn't mean, because I know with like ACTRA or whatever, the actors union, they're like not allowed to do non-union rate stuff. There's a limit there, and I think that in the creative sector, that would be a huge suffocating impact if everyone unionized, but then you could only do union activities. I think it would mean that a lot of people's actual gross revenue would decrease, because sometimes, okay, yes, getting a union or full rate paid gig is great, but you still need those little gigs that pay a little bit but are less, and they help you build community and this, that, and the other thing. There's all sorts of intangibles associated. So I'm like wary of the union move, and I'm interested in different models of negotiating and advocating to create industry standards, just because of, I guess, some of my experiences with the musicians union, and also just seeing where the gaps in their thinking, and I guess this goes back to what Laurence was saying about sort of sectoral based negotiating, that there's people who fall through the cracks, and like, and we don't, that's the weird thing with art, is you have the hobbyists, and then you have the professionals, and then you have a gazillion different things in between. So yeah, there's like my aunt who likes to go and take the pictures of the birds around her, her porch and stuff, and she sometimes like makes Christmas cards out of them and goes to the little group shows and stuff in Pembroke, Ontario. Should she be, where does she fall within? Or the person who plays guitar and they play one show a year playing a bunch of country covers, like, where do they fall within the scheme as we sort of industrialize it and sectoralize it more? So I think there needs to be both flexibility and, but there does need to be publicly available minimum standards so that people can talk. And I think this is, the Transparency Project sounds amazing for this, so that people can talk about where they're falling against some kind of baseline standard that's considered livable.
One quick thing I wanted to add, and then get to Hugo and Laurence, is just, I think there needs to be a massive public education campaign around this legislation that's happening. I don't think people are aware it's happening at all, particularly in the English-speaking artist community in Quebec and Montreal. But I think a lot of artists aren't really, they think about themselves as constantly working, but I don't think that they think of themselves as workers in this traditional unionized worker sense. And there needs to be some sort of education on what that would look like as someone who is an artist. That got me excited thinking about that, but I think that is something that would have to happen, like education first, and then seeing how these artists could fit into that union system. But Hugo, you had your hand up, and then Laurence.
Yeah. I just wanted to add maybe some details and precisions on that law. And well, James, you mentioned CARFAC, and CARFAC, what the great thing that they managed to do, CARFAC, is to convince the grants provider to not give grants to spaces that don't pay their fees. So in that context, when you get money, you pay Carfax. So you pay like what the union said. The second detail about the union law in Quebec is that it would not create a union in a sense of a, like, I don't know, train conductor union. It's a union that has, the union is not necessarily a negotiating contract for your sake. They're negotiating baseline contracts. And then because of the law, those baseline contracts become the law. Like that, it's like the minimum working condition for artists. But the difference with normal unions is under this structure, individual artists, because they are still freelancers, can negotiate like their own fees, that they're not bound to the contract. Yeah, those were the two details I wanted to highlight. And what Laurence said about RAV, which is very interesting because RAV is like Carfax in Quebec, but doesn't have the impact that Carfax has, but now will have the legal power of having much more power than Carfax. And there's this thing, so like if nothing happens, by default, they will be the union. And that's not a good or bad thing. It's just like Elise said, it's a question of awareness. Nobody knows what RAV thinks about. And so there's a question of mobilization that is very important, because the law passed, but the law passes like this is now legal. But the new rules, so they won't exist until those contracts are negotiated. So right now, there's no difference from before until in 5 or 10 years. So we are in this weird period of time where the future contracts negotiated will become law. It's very interesting. So that was my comment.
So Hugo, you mentioned that one thing that Carfax was successful in was to convince funders that you could only get a subsidy if you were paying Carfax fees. But that's only true when it comes to exhibition fee, right? So the Carfax fee schedule, it includes a lot of different fees for a lot of different activities. And it's true that promoters are going to respect across the board, they're respecting the exhibition fee, but then for the rest of the activities that artists can engage in, it's going to depend. Like what's going to be paid to them is going to depend on the institution's budget. And so I think that's a major difference if you compare the Carfax fee schedule to a collective agreement, because if you do have a collective agreement establishing minimal conditions, then you're bound to respect everything that's written in the collective agreement. So it would help to sort of further standardize working conditions across the sector. But I think that it's really good we're bringing up Carfax fees, because earlier when I was saying like we don't really know what the HAV has been doing since this bill was adopted, is that maybe one of the reason is because in the visual arts sector in Quebec, at least, the HAV has, developed a lot of relationship with the promoters, and they did come to a lot of informal tacit agreements about how it was going to be working. And so this thing of like paying the exhibition fee across, for instance, all the Artist Run Center network, that's a really good example of like a soft regulation that do work to a certain extent. And that's super interesting. So that's why the HAV isn't so quick to sort of engage in collective negotiation and negotiating collective agreements. But one thing that I think is super interesting is how, they decided with Bill 35, what they decided to do is to basically sort of extend the law that was already covering the performing artists and sort of allow the same powers and include the visual artists, the métier d'art, and then the literature into this same type of legal framework. It's true that there has been some changes, but basically the idea is to replicate the model that existed in the performing arts and the visual arts. But then I think there's only, that I know of at least, there's only one study that's been done on the efficiency of the law as it was, at least covering performing artists. And it shows that this legal framework is not enough to provide decent work to artists for a lot of different reasons that are more structural in nature. And I know, Rowan, you've been talking a lot about structural issues, and I'm there with you on that. And the fact that there isn't enough work for all the artists that are looking for work. So that's a major challenge to making this type of legal regulation really work for all the artists. So what we see is that it's actually working for the artists that are really well known, that are accessing like regular gigs, that are making a lot of money. But then for artists who are not so successful in securing like regular gigs, it doesn't work so well. And then if you ask them, in addition to their very meager, like very, is that a word, meager income? Yeah. If you ask them to sort of put 2.5% of their fee into like funding programs through the unions, then you're going to get resistance. And this is something that we're seeing now in the literature sector as well. So I think that these dynamics are like, it's not so easy to regulate artistic labor through like formal legal regulations. And for a very long time, the Quebec frameworks were really identified in the labor law literature as a super innovative model. And now we're sort of seeing like people were so happy with Bill 35, and at least from my perspective, I was like, whoa, this is not ambitious at all. We're basically replicating a model that doesn't really work for artists, actually.
Most of who a union will be able to negotiate with are going to be public or semi-public, like nonprofit organizations. So it's, in the case of visual arts, it's going to be like the big galleries like the MAC. Maybe, yeah, they'll be able to do something with a network of artist-run centers or something. In the music world, it's like the symphony orchestras, but it doesn't trickle down to, you know, a lot of the spaces where people work, and those public institutions, they ultimately have pretty fixed budgets. So, and in the grand scheme of things, it's totally fixed because the arts councils, who primarily fund the public institutions, the institutional spaces, there's a pie, and it's finite, and it grows a little bit depending on who's in power, and at that level of government. It also shrinks depending on who's in power, but it doesn't, it's not a flexible envelope. And so if you do increase the minimum fees for certain kinds of presentation, you're going to see exactly what Laurence was describing. You're necessarily going to see, well, okay, we definitely want this named artist, this artist of renown on the show, so we're going to pay whatever their fee is. Oh, we could have 5 other artists because we have 5 more walls or whatever. Or I guess, oh, now that the minimums are higher, we're going to... So not to say that people should be poorly paid, but there literally is a finite number of... And this is something that I grappled with in my work with Swanee when we were discussing raising artist fees, because you know, we were paying amounts that just we couldn't get into, especially during the pandemic, for work that we were doing like live streams, but still it was work that involved people gathering together. So we're actually putting you at a health risk to pay you. We were just like, we can't ask you to like risk your life for $100. Like that does not. No, we can't do that. So we had a lot of internal discussions about pay rates and raising them. And one of the things we did have to admit is, in order to pay people better, in order to bring up the quality of the quality, like the working conditions, we had to reduce activity. And so there's a trade-off, and depending on the artist and how their practice is going, it's not a value. Yes, it's not a value neutral adjustment to be like, okay, we're bringing down the amount of activities. There's people who maybe even at the meager amount that was being offered, that activity being more consistent was useful to them. So these are also, I don't know, that's just another concern that we're always talking about, especially when we're talking about these big sectoral things. We're literally talking about a very fixed amount of money, and it's very easy to discover exactly what that cap is, because, you know, the governments and the art councils have to publish their annual reports telling us how much money they give out and stuff. And then you get into the private sector, and it's all different.
Yeah, so Rowan and Laurence, I just wanted to give you an opportunity if there was any last things you wanted to say that you didn't get the chance to mention.
I think my final note, well, okay, first of all, hearing that there's like standardized rates for musicians, but they're not even public, that is shocking. I'm like annoyed on your behalf. I don't get why you would even standardize, or like why? And even if it's different across the country, maybe like just explain why that is. I don't know. If you're like, yeah, we're paying less in like New Brunswick or something than like Toronto, you're like, maybe you can quantify why that is or something. But anyway, so that is really strange to me. But I think the last thing, yeah, and I like related to that, my last thought is just like, whatever's happening, just own it, just be honest. Like, I feel like the main starting point, like we've talked about how like it's not necessarily super clear what to do in the end with all these conversations, what next steps to take. It's really complicated. There's a lot of things mixing together here. There's a lot of different issues and so many different kinds of artists and art. But I feel like as a starting place, you just have to stand behind your life and be honest and open about what money looks like in your life, or how it comes into your life. And that is, and the people who are like the organizations or the funders also, I think, should have a responsibility to be honest and transparent about that, because that is like the only starting point that makes any sense to me.
Yeah, I'm just going to conclude by saying that this was a very nice conversation, and I thank you all for participating and for inviting me. I think what I wish us for the future is definitely more experimentations and mobilization, and I really hope to see more of these forms of policy from below. This is coming from an article that I've read by Greg Deputer, but I really like this expression of like making politics from below. And I think that artists and cultural workers do it all the time. And there's like, we can amplify this work, and we can get more people interested in it. And I really do hope we'll find a way to maybe make this precarity less intense, so that workers, cultural workers and artists can actually have the time and the mental space to sort of get more involved in everyday politics, because they do have a lot to contribute. Thank you.